We have two amazing presenters with us today. Kara Ayers, you all know from our LEND program. Dr. Susan Wiley, I'm not sure if you've had an opportunity to meet her yet, but she is the division director for our division in DDBP, and she's a developmental and behavioral pediatrician. And we're always excited when she can join us for this session. And so, yeah, and Kara is a doctor too.
I'm trying to catch those words we use, and I do it too.
A different kind.
Yeah.
I'm not the one responding on an airplane, so Dr. Wiley's going on the air.
No, let me tell you, it's not good. Like, oh, maybe somebody else will go first.
Yeah, I think everybody knows that Kara is a doctor too. So, yeah, thanks for calling me out. Yeah,
that's all good.
All right, so we'll pass it to you, ladies, you doctors.
No, and I'm fine being called Susan, so that's all good. Yeah, and I guess I've got us started, but we're gonna kind of go back and forth a little bit. We're super excited to be here. We want this to be interactive, so feel free to stop. I am going to have some questions as we go along, so hopefully you get more out of it that way. And I think we're going to go to the next slide, please. And I'm hoping, yeah. Wait a second. Yeah, hold it there. Okay, yeah. So does anybody have ideas about what's the difference between ethics and morality? And I'm good with people talking. I mean, I'll try to keep my eye on the chat, but what do you think the difference is?
We're good at waiting you out, so.
We are.
Ethics and morality. What do you think the difference is? It's okay if you're wrong.
Oh, I'm not even sure I have the right answer, so we'll just
that's
put it
good.
that way. Yeah. I know people get training in this, so some of you know that. So why don't we start with what's ethics? Is there a definition for ethics that you have?
I think I would say that ethics are like societal standards for what's right and wrong, versus maybe morality is more personal, like what you think of what you think is right and wrong. So I've always thought of ethics as more general in a community sense, versus morality is like personal. But I don't know if it's right or wrong.
Yeah, no. And I also see in the chat someone thinking that morals are values, and these could be instilled culturally through your family, through society, religion, and ethics is right or wrong. So we'll decide at the end of this if we think ethics is there a right or wrong within ethics. Other thoughts people have? Ethics can have a legal component. Great. I mean, anything else that people want to add to, maybe a little more on the ethics side, because I'm hearing more on the moral side. Other definitions of ethics. So Jason is saying there's a systems component. Yeah, and I probably ought to ask Kara what's her definition of ethics, because I think you're right. We'll start with morality. So moral judgments as we do make them. So what would you say is something that is morally good? What, I mean, anything people want to put out there of what they would say something that is morally good?
According to Benjamin, well, I was just going to make a joke that according to Benjamin Franklin, beer.
Well, it could be morally good. It depends.
No, but he says that beer is the reason that that God loves us.
Ah, gotcha. It's his indication.
It's a quote that I've seen. Yeah, I mean,
Right.
obviously within any morals things, there can also be debate on whether it is or not.
True. We'll keep away from the alcohol theme of morality, blue laws, and so forth. Someone else was going to say something as well. Sorry, it's hard for me to.
I was just gonna say like promoting peace in society.
Okay, promoting peace. So tell me, like, how would you do that?
By the way that like people personally act or government systems act.
Okay. I see people too, like doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, treating others like you would want to be treated. Some people would say treating others the way they want to be treated takes it a slightly different interpretation than the do unto others. And Jessica's saying it's our steering wheel for deciding if something is right or wrong. Oh, nice. Checking in with the family on a regular basis. Yeah. So some of these things that you guys have hit upon, these were just some examples that, when I shovel my neighbor's snow, that's a morally good thing to do. Donating a blood or an organ, being truthful, being honest. So Courtney mentioned, honesty. So on the flip side, what can we say is morally bad? Don't go further on that one yet there, Kara, though. What might be morally bad? What can we agree? I mean, because I think we can mostly agree that these things are good to do. Shoveling snow, donating an organ, being truthful. But what would you think is morally bad?
Harming others.
Seeing stealing and lying, withholding information, murder, killing someone. Great. Yeah. Is killing always bad? Yes. Some people say yes. I mean, killing for profit probably is bad. What if, these are goes back to hurting others intentionally. What is it, those what if questions? If you knew that you were going to kill somebody who would do horrendous things to a multitude of society, is that a bad thing? That's where I think it gets kind of, yes.
Well, and even within this situation, the suicide laws are one of the things that are in question, is whether they're ethical or moral, because of some of the systemic systems that also go around it. Because it's not just about the person themselves in the situation, but sometimes the larger systems themselves.
Yeah. Risha's bringing up a good one too, is that sometimes we might be making a choice but based on our interest rather than the interest of the patient. Self-defense. That might actually be a reason to kill. I think that's what you're saying, Kelly. That might not be morally bad. All right, let's hit some of those. So I think you've hit a lot of some of those, like killing. Some of these are from Ann Lovell, who gave this talk forever ago. So she put killing for profit as morally bad because it's kind of confusing. Cheating on an exam may not be good. I'm not sure what a bad parent really is, but and then even lying, is lying always morally bad? So if somebody wants to know if their haircut's nice, and you do a little white lie, is that morally bad, or is that just a little fib? All right, let's go to the next one. So ethics. People have had talked about this a little bit. Let me try to go back. I think there was really, thanks. We'll just talk. Really, it's more about systematizing our moral judgments, questions, and practices. So we're trying to build a framework for answering questions. What is the right course of action? Who gets to decide? What kind of person should I be? And so again, when we look at ethics and that framework, we're really thinking about who we want to become. So there's a theologian that said, ethics has to consider the kind of persons we want to become, the choices we are forced to make, and the kind of communities we want to build. So ethics really does bring that broader community and society into play.
All right, and my Zoom is being a little weird in that the mute and unmute is disappearing and coming. So if you don't hear me, that's where I went. But so we wanted to talk a little bit about why our ethics. Oh, is this one mine? Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
I have a lot of animation. So just so you
Yeah.
guys know, we were trying to merge our thoughts together. And so I do a lot of animation to try to get more of that conversation. But like, yeah, it's all good.
It's hard to toss back and forth. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
All right. So we wanted to talk a little bit about why ethics are important. I think Dr. Wise given a good introduction of the differences, but also how they kind of blur together. And so I think that you'll see in our discussions too at the end, I love this topic. I call it kind of my brain food because I love to think about different perspectives and put myself in different shoes with these kinds of issues. And so I have the opportunity to sit on our hospital's ethics committee. And not only do I think talking through those issues is so important, but I always come away with like different perspectives that I never would have thought of. So as we talk through today what seem like kind of these like big abstract issues, I hope that you'll also know that these play out within the doors of our hospital and beyond and wherever you go with your career. So and I find them super interesting, so hopefully that'll come across today. So why they're important is that we live within these relationships. We're not in a vacuum. So it would be easier if we could come up with like this flow chart of decision making for all of these, but all of our relationships and definitely the diversity of our cultures impact that. And I think you'll see today too, and I hope you hear this from the start to the finish, that there are not always right or wrong answers to these questions. So we really want you to continually question if you feel like an issue is black or white and really try to see that gray. I think we're increasingly realizing too that gray can also be where we lose sight of maybe where a diversity issue is impacting the question or a relationship or something else, so that we really want you to challenge yourself to think about those different perspectives and also where you come from bringing your perspectives, because that can enrich the conversation, but also maybe we bring our own biases to these. I think you'll hear as we sort out and discuss some of these issues how individuals have different interests and priorities. And so that makes it so challenging when Dr. Wiley in a little bit is going to talk about the best interest principle, about how we often use that as a reasoning basis in terms of what's in the person's best interest. But you can see how difficult that would be when we bring so many different interests and priorities to the table. And then that patients and families and care providers have different agendas for care or cure. And we see that emerge in our larger healthcare landscape as well. So one of the groups that I'm a part of is PCORI, Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute is the acronym for PCORI. And this is just, it's a huge kind of healthcare transformation entity that's based around the whole idea of centering what are patients' outcomes that matter to them. So in the past, I think the field of medicine used to think that we all had this list of outcomes that we aimed for, and we started to realize that patients and families actually had a great deal of diversity in what their goals were, and that sometimes those goals and outcomes differed from what the medical team might have guessed them to be. So rather than guessing, now we're asking people, what are your goals? What's your agenda? And we're actually directing research and treatment goals towards that. So, so a lot of the topics that we're talking about today are reflected in many different ways in our healthcare landscape. So there's lots of graphics. I just pulled the same one that I used in our opening or my opening lecture with you guys around values and disability. I remember we talked quite a bit about the difference between equality and equity. And that's going to be important for you to remember again, because, if we take it like a level further, if we think about, maybe a community program that has a grant for a community to try to up healthy living in a neighborhood. And so they give everybody the same bike. it sounds great, but that same bike won't work for everybody. So it really does take some more individualized care to make sure that everybody has not only a bike that fits them, but also, you know, the training and the support they need to get out there and get the exercise that the program intended them to get. And for some people, that might just mean the standard bike and no additional training. For other people, that might mean an adapted bike and some help transferring on and off it. And so equality doesn't get us where we need, and we really try to remember that in ethical discussions as well. And let us know if you have questions. I'm sorry I lost the chat. We don't have
Yeah,
any.
I see a question.
Yeah.
How does this work in cognitive senses also?
And Jason, can you tell me, do you mean this graphic?
Well, I just mean making things equitable as well. We sometimes, especially within the disability movement, usually use a lot of physical imagery, which makes sense, especially understanding the history of some of the movements. But there's also ways around different types of accessibility as well that are sometimes legally or not legally covered to go into that. And just like, how would we, I guess like in terms of this graphic, how would you also be able to think about how to put that into an infographic with the cognitive, just because you usually the equity sort of thing comes from a physical standpoint, which isn't a bad thing. It's just having diversity of also showing different parts of disability or equity as well.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, maybe I'm taking this in a different direction than you're intending, but one way I think about that, trying to think about it more concretely, is as a physician, if I'm going to try to consent someone for a procedure, I need to make sure that that information is accessible. And that could be, that may mean different things to different people. And particularly, perhaps you understand better through listening or visualization or those sorts of things. So I don't think we're very good at that sort of adaptability for inclusion within the healthcare system out there. But that may be another kind of way. If I think about equity in a consent process, I need to think about the many ways people learn and how they'll best process the information.
Yeah, I definitely think that ties into the actual thing that comes from the output of having a quick infographic like this that visualizes the concept in some short, simple way, but then it can be expanded upon later. Sorry, I don't mean to sidetrack her.
No, I think it does fit in with the example, because what Dr. Wiley is mentioning too might take more time. And unfortunately, the way our, even our appointments and our episodes are set up are these very rapid, at all equal time increments. And so ideally, if we truly were to kind of restructure with equity in mind, we would have more flexibility with those appointment types to offer that cognitive access. I did realize why I was a little bit disoriented is that it looks like we skipped over this slide. So it does fit now, I think. I just wanted to introduce these kind of 3 vocabulary words for you, because I think we're going to be hearing even more about these in the coming years. So we have a new ethicist, or she's relatively new in the last couple of years, Dr. Elizabeth Lamphere, here at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And one of her areas of expertise is in moral distress in healthcare. And so working with her, I really learned a little bit more about this topic, but you've probably seen this translated in the headlines recently about just the feelings of overwhelm and just despair in our healthcare system due to the COVID waves. And so these are some words that I wanted to introduce so that you could kind of connect what we mean by this. So the first is moral distress. And so this occurs when a healthcare professional feels what they're expected to do conflicts what they believe to be ethically right. And so in our hospital, whenever, and hopefully other hospitals as well, but whenever professionals feel this sense of distress, we hope that they will feel comfortable reaching out for an ethical consult, because this is a way that our ethics team can kind of help listen to both parties or more than one party, or connect voices, because that distress has a negative impact on our teams. And a couple other words to introduce are just moral courage, which is speaking up despite fear. And that fear might be related to, ramifications, retaliation even, or the fear can also be that, sometimes you don't know if you're the only one that feels that way. and if you're familiar with a lot of our Speak Up for Safety campaigns in the hospital, a lot of it is based around kind of the science of moral courage and trying to instill that that strength in people to speak up even in times where they're not quite sure. And then moral resilience is the ability to keep one's integrity intact in response to moral distress. So, you know, much of what you see in healthcare systems right now is an attempt to keep resilience strong within within our teams. And so I wanted to introduce these words. You'll see them increasingly, I think, in the next few years. There are also words that researchers are using to study how, you know, people are bouncing back through this adversity, and when they're not, how can we help them in that transition? So
Can I just,
yeah.
can I add in, I mean, this is really important, and it's also got a power differential embedded in our systems, right? Because you are all mostly still students and you're still being evaluated. So that moral distress and moral is going to happen. The moral courage to speak up in spite of fear is much trickier depending on where the locus of power is.
Yep.
So I recognize that in my own, I guess, trajectory as a medical student or resident or fellow, I felt different about my ability to speak up or speak as far. And now I'm in this position of power, so I can speak up, you know, I can speak up more readily. And I think that's another aspect of this that's really helpful to think about, is when you are in those positions that are not power, how do you still speak up? How do you still get yourself heard? Who are your allies in helping you get there? And I agree, like, that the ethics committee is always an ally and somebody that anyone can reach out to. So
Yeah. And I think maybe depending on your experience in healthcare too, you might be imagining different situations of where someone might feel moral distress. And so I do think it's important to point out that it's not only in situations where someone feels like they're being asked to do something like nefarious or evil or wrong. Sometimes, and I think we see this frequently as members of the ethics committee, in our setting, it can be that a lot of the bedside healthcare team can feel really conflicted about a child who, you know, is really sick or really seems to be in pain. And so there's questions of, you know, parents maybe aren't at the bedside and we don't know why they're not at the bedside, but that can be very morally distressing for the healthcare team to see kids, you know, in situations where we, you know, ideally we would want all kids to not be in pain and to have their parents and loved ones next to them. So sometimes it's, and actually in what I've observed many times, it's more cases like that. So the kind of thing that people are being asked to do that they feel conflicted about is not necessarily something, you know, that someone is like nefariously plotting. It's a situation that's out of everybody's control, but is really difficult to see day in and day out. All right, so I'm going to get us back to where we were. All right, so I think we've made a pretty good case about why this is important, but we want you to have a better understanding of these different dilemmas, because we've also noticed that they can help us address health inequities. So I've mentioned for you before our work with the Center for Dignity in Healthcare for People with Disabilities, and we were given some issues that were noted as kind of hotspots for health inequities. And what we notice, even though these topics are really quite different, so our topics are organ transplantation, prenatal diagnosis, suicide prevention, and end-of-life care, they seem very different, but these are actually all very common topics that come up in ethics committees across the world in any hospital. And so what we notice with that is there are also hotspots for different outcomes for different groups of people. And so we hope that you'll see that intersection between health inequities and difficult ethical decisions, so that we can ensure that we're talking through bias as we look through these frameworks and policies. And a little bit later in this talk too, we'll talk about what disability scholars have thought about kind of the field of ethics and how we really need to be extra intentional to look for bias in frameworks and policies. And when I say policies, I also mean, you know, from a hospital level policy, we actually have really good, clear guidance on a lot of these issues all the way up to higher level federal, state legislation as well. So policies, as a reminder, folks, goes all different levels. And I'm looking at our numbers, Susan. I think this.
No, I'm like,
one-
I think I'm lost.
Okay, I think you're the next one. All right, so this is my last one. We decided to kind of ping pong back and forth, guys, so you could get the best of both of us. Okay, so what is an ethical dilemma? It's a situation where there's disagreement among well-meaning people about what should be done. So I think you could also say reasonable people, meaning that it's a situation where there's kind of not a clear-cut direction one way or the other. Sometimes an ethical dilemma is raised because family or patient and the healthcare team varies about a decision, but it could also be an ethical dilemma between different members of the healthcare team itself. So, so the disagreement can happen in different places. It's also a situation where there's tension or a conflict of values. So someone is obligated by one moral standard to do one thing, and another person is obligated by a different moral standard to do something else. And so again, it's that area of gray. There's not necessarily a clear course of action, and a choice is demanded. So we can't just kind of hang out in the middle. We need to make a decision one way or the other. So, okay, now I'll pass it to you, Dr. Wiley.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about some frameworks, and then specifically go through some of the topics or how we make those decisions. So there are folks who really think about ethical consequences of actions, while others think more about our intention. So is it the end point, or is it what we hoped would happen? And then there's agent-centered theories, which really look more at the overall ethics status of individuals or agents, and they're not quite as linked to morality. But one of the medical fields, we have all these words. So I was going to have us try to have you all define, what do you think when we say we're making a decision out of autonomy? What does that really mean? What are the core premises of making a decision on autonomy? Any ideas on that? You can speak up, chat it.
I'm going to guess and say it's an individual person's right to make the decision that they feel is best for them to maintain that personal. I know you're not supposed to use the definition with the word, but to maintain their personal autonomy.
Correct. You're absolutely right. It is that we want to be able to choose for ourselves. So, and it's based on our personal value, and it respects the person. So absolutely, you hit it. What about non-maleficence? It's not a new Disney film, but when we say we're trying to do something out of non-maleficence, what's a more understandable word? Do no harm, I see in the checkbox. Yeah, it is essentially avoiding harm or protecting folks from harm who may be in a vulnerable situation. So what about beneficence? What does that sound like? That's not the sequel. Sorry, I'll stop Disneying. What do you think beneficence means? Do good. I see Kim saying do good. And really doing good for another or something that benefits others. So yeah, I see best interest there. I'm trying to see, yes. Oh, let me see here. Let me pop back up a little bit because, okay. All right, well, how about justice? What do we think justice means? Like if you were to kind of define that. I'm going to act in a just way. Fair care between all. And we've already talked about how hard that is to figure out what that means. But yeah, I think this is probably the closest to the equity concept of giving each person what's deserved, treating with equality, fairness, and sometimes that's also used in thoughts of distribution of resources. So how do we fairly distribute resources that may be limited? Okay, next one. We have two more attributes. Veracity, that's probably somewhat self-evident. Oh, I see, protecting everyone's rights. Yes, okay. Thank you, James. And then, yeah, telling that, yeah, that's fine. This was an easy one. But what about fidelity? What is fidelity? That's a little trickier one. But yeah, actually back to the telling the truth. It's also not withholding. So you can have, you know, what is it? Sins of omission. We want to not withhold information either. My grandmother was very much of the era that the doctor just told you what to do and you didn't even know that you might have cancer, but and that would not have followed the tenet of veracity. How about fidelity? Any thoughts? So that one is really about faithfulness. Great. Integrity. Those are, yes, I like those answers. Thank you. It's really keeping your promises to your patient, your profession, maintaining that trusting relationship with clients or those you're working with. So that really gets it a bit more to your personal interaction piece and as well as to your field. You're up, Kara. You're right.
Okay, so we mentioned in the beginning, I gave the example of best interest and just that requirement that people who care for others will do so in good faith and place the person's interests above their own. And I think that's something that sometimes we take for granted as well, especially when placing someone else's interests above their own may come with kind of a lot behind the scenes or behind the curtains. So I think we see that often in care for care of medically complex kids when we have an assumption that a parent is going to, you know, sometimes those two things might come into conflict. So we know that, if, for example, you know, institutional living for a child is not in a child's best interest by most, you know, standards. And when we look at lots of different ways to measure, but our current system, especially when we think about the nursing care shortage in the community right now, there's a misalignment, there's a gap. So, I mean, we have many kids that are stuck in this place between hospital and home because, you know, what's in their best interest and what community supports are available and what their parents may be able to provide don't align. So that best interest is kind of easier said than done in some cases. And it's based on the ethical principles of beneficence and non-maleficence. So this is an example. We kind of gave you this one where we wanted to show you the mix of those two principles, but we are going to challenge you to think about those terms that we've just hopefully for some of you, at least those terms are a review. I know that in some of your fields, you've focused in on those with ethics courses and things. So as we think through issues, do challenge yourself to use those terms that Dr. Wiley just introduced. And this one is a combination. Anything else to add on that one?
Looks good.
Okay. All right, so when we go through a best interest analysis, if we try to think about kind of pros and cons or benefits and burdens, these are just examples. And I know burden is also a trigger word in the disability community, at least it is for me. But in this case, we're looking through more so what we need to be aware of in terms of you know, things that could shift the balance. So things that can also be out of our awareness. I think it's really important that we recognize if we expect parents to kind of meet this really difficult standard of best interest in some cases, we do need to be honest about what that means that they'll be experiencing that maybe other people won't see or experience with them. So when we do case analysis like this on the ethics side of things, we want to look at, does a treatment prolong life? Does it improve quality of life? And I think I've talked with a group before about also how heavily weighed that quality of life, not only that term, but also the way that we discuss that in medical settings when that gets brought up in meetings that I'm a part of, if we're talking about a patient or a situation, one of the first questions I always ask is, how is quality of life measured? And almost always it wasn't actually measured. And so it allows whoever is kind of reporting on quality of life to take a step back and give me more insight into how they came up with this conclusion. And so it lets me know are we making assumptions about a person's quality of life? In some cases, there have been assumptions about quality of life of an individual that the people discussing it have never even met or have never. So it's all based on kind of what we think our quality of life would be like in their situation. And we do have research that tells us that as human beings, we're really bad at guessing what quality of life would be like in a disabled state or in even a different state from our own. We can't kind of change that perspective in an accurate way. So we need to be really careful if we're making clinical decisions based on quality of life.
Yeah, can I just add on, like, the things that we use to measure that are not good.
Right.
So we think we're doing some good stuff by looking at it. Yeah, we're trying. You have to look at the tools with which are used to rate quality of life and how they were developed and what framework they were being used from. So I just always put a call out on that, because we can think we're doing good. In fact, we might not be using an accurate tool, and just really hitting that same topic, Kara, that you were saying, is like, who's really defining it? And I see Jason has his hand raised as well.
Yeah, to talk about that, and I know some of the data is in the links I sent on the bioethics series from the National Council on Disabilities, which talks about some of these stuff if people are interested in the medical field. And just even within that data, they show a huge difference between how doctors see people with disabilities quality of life versus the person themselves and how they see the quality of life, and that there's a pretty big discrepancy there. And I think some of the questions is too, like with ethic boards and stuff, is how they're usually done behind the scenes. So people don't exactly know how decisions are made, but I could be wrong on that because I'm only reading based on what I've seen on those things. And Dr. Ayers and Dr. Wiley would know way better than I would.
Well, I think the key is the ethics board rarely tells anyone what to do. So there usually isn't an actual decision made by an ethical board, and they try to have representation, though I think that can be very varied. So I guess I would say that, and I think you're right that, and in fact, a lot of times when I think about these aspects of challenge, is because when I think about the people who have entered the medical field and the value system that we hold, even in that decision to join the healthcare field, there are some embedded strong value systems in there that may not be everyone's, that are not everyone's value systems. And so I think that's for me to remember as I walk into an interaction or an experience, that where are my biases and my values, and really getting to the other perspectives of where value lies.
Yeah, great points. Yeah, so this kind of like weighing, there's no necessary endpoint, and that is really kind of the, I think you bring up a good point, Jason, that there's a lack of transparency around a lot of ethics decisions, but it is, as Dr. Wiley said, especially in our setting, it's almost like, I always laugh when people say like, oh, call the ADA. Like, you can't actually call the ADA where they're going to like give you the answer or sort it out for you, or even tell you if something's in a violation of ADA. It's the same about the ethics committee. Is sometimes you'll hear people say, make an ethics complaint or call the ethics. And this is not, but it's not to say that at least I don't feel like the group is, like powerless or doesn't make decisions. What we try to do is like learn from each situation and then adjust the system as a whole. So as an example, some hospitals employ what's called a red flag system. So anytime that an organ transplant is denied, it raises a red flag and requires like a systematic evaluation of making sure kind of that bias wasn't a process of that. So one of the decisions of our ethics committee is the red flag system most effective? Or you also have to think about things like committee kind of saturation, in that is it more effective to review kind of a case by case if there are variables that indicate that bias could have kind of played a role. So those are the types of like systematic or policy decisions that maybe one case sparks for us, but we don't necessarily like rule on that one case. Instead, we try to kind of adjust the climate towards that goal of more ethical and equitable treatment.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to come down on the ethics committee, because what I see them doing
yeah.
is querying more to understand what's behind decisions, or why there is conflict of ideas of where to head. So I feel like they do a great job of helping us all see the broader perspective. Communication is nearly always foundational in these scenarios. So.
No, you're exactly right. I do think it's important to know that it's probably going to be like that no matter where you go. And there's a huge misperception that these committees like vote, and I have not heard of, maybe there are, but I haven't heard of any entities that like vote. That would seem very unethical in a way. So I don't know. So this analysis could take place between, an individual case, or it could be measured, at a more systemic level, and considering well, the stress of staff or teams or staff shortages and what the impacts are having. Or so you could take this as kind of small or as large as you wanted, but it gives you an idea of what do we really mean when we say best interest, because that feels like this big abstract term that can be hard to define. And I'm sure, we could take any one of these bullets under what people can consider invasive and inhumane has changed over time now. And I know with my own personal experience, so my bone condition, osteogenesis imperfecta, my bones as they grew in a bowed kind of way. So I used to call them, sorry, I got a stuffy nose today, my little mountains. So the bottom of my legs had like little mountains. And so at that time, there was a lot of controversy about whether it was inhumane and too invasive to rod the legs, which involves, gross term, but shish kebabbing at that time. Now they have less invasive ways, but at that time they actually, you can imagine if you had a curved bone, you actually had to cut it lengthways, and then you had to cut it multiple times. You had multiple fractures that you put a rod in the middle of and straightened. And so there was a lot of debate within the parent community as I was growing up, where my mom had a really difficult decision of, on one side, people were saying it's inhumane to put kids through that surgery, especially if they're not going to walk. And on the other side, people were saying, but it can prevent fractures. And even if the child doesn't walk, it could, reduce pain in the future. So now there's pretty much agreement that that procedure is far less invasive now, but now it's commonly accepted. You don't see those debates anymore in the parent community for the most part. Everybody agrees now that rodding is best practice. But, just 20 years ago, that was not the case, and people were adamantly, for and against, and I'm sure some of our controversies today are similar. I did have my legs were rotted, and I'm glad my mom made that decision, I guess. So Jason?
Yeah, because I know there's some things within the parents' communities and those are, but what happened if it's a community, because there's a lot of, especially in some of the psychology and like ABA or some other things of where it is actually, this happened with other groups as well in the disability rights and justice movement, of people with disabilities also saying this is wrong, or this is, because that has a different ethical consideration. And so, and I know sometimes that gets weighed differently based on ideas of who understands what, or who, and expertise in some things. And sorry, just curious.
No, so I'll throw a little bit to that ring, because I see this too in the community, and whether signing is good for you or bad for you, or spoken language is good for you or bad for you. And I probably have flip-flopping of my upbringing. So I grew up with an aunt and uncle who worked at a Ohio School for the Deaf, so I had a much more deaf cultural perspective, and I still carry that perspective in me as being somebody who is fully hearing. But you also have to bring it back to the individual and the decision making at an individual level of what is right for that individual. And I agree, it's very challenging because we're making decisions for our children who don't have the capacity to choose at that moment in time. But there are periods of time where those choices feel more pressured to do something. And then families, the push and pull across, and I really am saying this, speaking to this more among the communication options in deaf and hard of hearing, puts families in the middle of a tug of war that doesn't benefit anyone. It certainly doesn't benefit the child. So I think as a provider, I have broadened my lens and tried to help families sort through the information rather than say you must do one way or another. So I don't know, that's more when I receive families who have a new diagnosis of autism, what are the various types of interventions? What do you feel fits how you want to work with your child? You do some of the looking and let's figure that out together. Like you're in the driver's seat, and let me help you walk through the varying information that's out there and whether that fits to your value system and your child's needs. I don't know. That's how I take it as a provider.
Yeah, I'm not a provider, but I also really challenge myself to adopt that approach. And I try to notice when I'm kind of feeling that emotional activation of an approach that I have strong feelings about. And of course, as a person, I can do that, but I try to be more in that neutrality zone in terms of an example actually that just happened yesterday. Somebody reached out to me and said, hey, I really need to know where's the best doctor on the East Coast for limb lengthening surgery, which is so in the achondroplasia community, which is dwarfism, the most common form of dwarfism that my son has, and that half the TLC reality stars have, if you've seen any of those families, the little Johnsons. So, and the surgery is very invasive. It involves multiple surgeries, very painful. I, have a personal opinion about it. But when I think about things like, well, that shouldn't be offered under insurance, for example, because it's not medically necessary. And then I remind myself, well, then you're going to create, an inequity that only people with private means to pay are going to be able to access a certain healthcare service that they feel strongly they need. And so I try to challenge myself to continue that perspective taking, even though, that issue is still really difficult for me because it just really saddens me that it's an aesthetic procedure that comes with a large physical cost, really, to be a bit closer to typical height and not to gain anything adaptive functioning wise. So that's a tough one for me that I'm working on. We'll see. All right, I think I'll toss it to you.
Yeah, and I think to some degree, our next slides kind of get you a little bit deeper into some tools. So one of the concepts in ethics is to really try to elicit narrative. So it doesn't take away the principles, but it does help you understand enough of the story, the values, what's behind actions to allow you to then better apply the principles. So what it really attempts to do is look at not where my symptom of trying to figure out, but who really get these collections of stories inside, the broader family perspective. They help us see what's at stake. They get a better sense of where the disagreements are occurring and maybe commonalities. So they help us frame up the situation. You can go to the next one. And really, when we're doing this, we want to think about how these narratives are constructed. When we hear a story, you go in and whose voice is given authority, which one, what are, you kind of almost do this as an English approach, is where are those plot lines? What's the relevance that's being highlighted? Are there resolutions? And it does take a long time, and you really do have to listen and really be there and let that voice be heard. You can go to the next one. So one approach that's a little bit more structured, if you are interested, is questions from And this is super helpful, particularly when there's cultural difference as well, because like, what do you call the problem? What do you think caused it? What do you think, why do you think it started when it did? You might get all sorts of answers that you would not get if you don't ask these questions. So it might be that somebody thinks, you might get a more value-based, or I'm trying to think, like, everything started when I yelled, like, you think about a kid, like, oh, when so-and-so yelled, I think that's what caused the baby to be bothered or affected. Kind of can get some of, I don't know what all those answers would be, but you get that sense of a belief system behind things. So what do you think it does? How severe is it? Is it going to be short or long? What kind do you think the treatment should be? Because sometimes, again, cultural differences, we may have a medical Western approach, and our idea of a treatment may actually be in direct opposition to what a family might think is the right course. And then again, what are the problems this has caused, and what do you fear most? And again, these are very linked to a physical condition, but I think you can apply this to a lot of things. So whether it's a behavior, whether it's and so again, illness really is very moral. It's a very moral experience, and particularly again when you think about more in that healthy status to a loss of health, that is a change and one that is often quite impactful. Things are on the line, and so sometimes these, again, what did I think I heard a speaker at AUCD is like, I might be in a wheelchair now, but most of you will be eventually. So, we're just on a different path. You can head forward. Oh yeah. And I think we were going to hit plenty on disability, because I feel like the disability piece we've embedded much better with Kara, so we'll just keep going. So again, it's not always easy to figure out how to apply the principles. It's not always obvious. Sometimes the principles conflict with each other, and we might pick one tenet over another in a certain situation. And these are usually because there's not a clear direction, or even with a treatment, we may not know that how effective that is, and is it really the right thing to do. And then, of course, your value system, religious and cultural beliefs will inform your decision making, and that's also, we've kind of hit that already in some of our conversation. I always like to give this book out. I just found it very helpful for me as a physician to kind of go, broaden my thinking out a little bit about why I might decide a treatment course. I may use a certain value system. Maybe it's data driven, maybe it's scientific, like what's the likelihood this is going to work? Someone else may use my grandpa lived till 100, never went to the doctor, never took a statin. Why would I need to take a medication to drop my cholesterol? Because he lived for a long time. So it really helped me broaden my framework of how people decide, and really thinking through those values to help make sure that I'm more effective at partnering and understanding, and then supporting that, and not just assuming my way is the way for everyone.
So we want to talk through some specific disability considerations with this. And I know that together we looked at different models of disability. But as Dr. Wiley brought up, the very medical training really emphasizes a medical model of disability, which can be based on a very pathological framework. And actually, there's some interesting research that shows that, unfortunately, as med students progress through their medical training, their implicit bias related to disability increases, not decreases. So that also speaks to, why we need to work extra diligently within our medical settings on making sure that people think about these disability specific considerations from different models from what our medical training emphasizes. Yeah, Jason.
Sorry, I don't want to be overly handed in this, so I'm interested in your opinion. But
Yeah.
we sometimes think, about how some of the bad pseudosciences of the 19th century and early 20th century, and a lot of the ways, some of the similar ways that we think about disability, while it's adapted, seem to have somewhat come out of those models in some sense and evolved in some sense. Not that it's 100%, or there shouldn't be any medicine or anything, thing, but we sometimes disentangle those two things sometimes to think of it, oh, that was bad and it was just in the past, and now it's here, and things are more ethical, or they don't take those approaches, even though there's still some stuff that is in line with it. Hopefully I'm not overstating that or making it too big of giving diligence that there is some still great practices and stuff.
Well, I think you're right. And I think it's beyond disability. There's a lot of oppression and horrific experiences in among African Americans and experiences with the healthcare field. So it's really important for me as a provider to know that, to know and own that history, and also recognize that people coming to me are going to have that framework of understanding who I am and who my field is. And so that interplay across us is really key, and impacts how we can get to a shared, I guess, relationship and trust or lack of trust. I mean, I do recognize those things.
Totally. I think there's, a lot of remnants, and the ones that I try to focus in on is asking, is this behavior or symptom or whatever it may be actually detrimental to the person, or is it detrimental to the person because of stigma? And, because we don't, especially if we're thinking about invasive procedures that people don't want, that really aren't going to benefit them, but that we're trying to fit people into society's kind of box. And an example comes to mind in that in a lot of I think to normalize Googling when you're in meetings, when you don't always understand. I think many people do that, maybe not everybody, but so we're, I think the beauty of interdisciplinary teams is sometimes we're using terms that we're like, what is that? But I've got to sort of act like I know what I'm talking about. So I was in a meeting where they kept bringing up this term, and I just made sure I had it right again. So I looked it up for you all. Sialorrhea. And they kept bringing up this person had sialorrhea, and the way they were referencing it seemed like this was like the worst thing on the planet. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is really serious. I got to look up what this is. And it turns out it was drooling. And so we were really like basing all of these assumptions about what this person could and couldn't do and quality of life all on drooling. And not that drooling, isn't an important thing to consider, and it's very important for lots of people. And the reality is it is stigmatized. And so we can't overlook that and, pretend we live in this all accepting world. But I think we do need to consider was, in this case, was the drooling bothersome to the person, or were we, worried about what the drooling meant to society? And there's lots of examples of remnants of where we're treating more of the stigmatization that we're trying to fight by instead of, really centering our care and treatment on what the individual needs and what will be best for them. So 2 words, hopefully, that you're familiar with too when you're thinking about disability issues is self-determination versus paternalism. And paternalism could also be maternalism, I think, in this case, because stereotypically, there are a lot of very strong non-disabled parent advocates, majority of which are mothers, that for their beliefs of what their children need are from the views of others standing in the way of progress in the disability world. Specifically, I'm thinking about a lot of efforts to deinstitutionalize, to shut down some of our institutions. In Ohio are definitely our largest and loudest, loudest, not largest, it's a few powerful voices, are moms of people with disabilities that are currently in developmental centers and very much believe those centers should stay open. And, their storytelling is one of messages of safety and making sure that, again, that best interest standard, they firmly believe that it is in their children's best interest to remain in these settings. And so it kind of continues this debate in Ohio and other states as well, whereas some states have moved past this debate in some ways. No states have it all figured out, but it's this tension between self-determination and paternalism that we see in many disability issues. Also, quality of life versus cure. So way to put like two trigger words together. They're thinking about framework and whose framework do we use to guide us to establish quality of life. Again, if we think of many strong parent movements, which, you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that parent movements also have spearheaded the way towards many important things in terms of, you know, towards education efforts to have more mainstream, more inclusion. But often if we use the framework established by non-disabled people, then we may be missing some that could be helpful for us to consider. Yeah, I see a good question for Jennifer. If you don't have time to ask your questions now, I can go ahead and put my email in the, oh, there you go, thanks. All right. And then I kind of gave a little preview to this in the, when I gave the example of kind of parent voices, sometimes in tension with disability advocate voices, that question of meaningful communication, community participation versus more restricted settings. You know, Ohio is also, Jane Gerhardt is working as part of a task force exploring what it would mean for Ohio to move away from sub-minimum wage settings or sheltered workshops. And you have a similar argument there where some people say, you know, I want my loved one to be in this setting where I know they're safe and they're taken care of, and I don't mind that they get paid, you know, $2 an hour or whatever it is. Whereas other people, you know, are saying that that is not okay to work for $2 an hour when a company is profiting on that. And that, but then there's this question of, well, what if it means that person won't have a setting anymore? So again, there's so many places that these ethical debates play out that no matter where you land, I think you'll be able to apply what we learned today. And then I know we've talked to you quite a bit about language around disability and identity first and person first. I just finished actually writing a commentary that will be out in the Journal of Disability and Health. And what myself and my co-authors are recommending is we hope that more journals will take a more inclusive and flexible approach in terms of accepting both person first and identity first language, and recognition that there's different preferences, different uses, and that we're better off kind of not trying to like referee between those two. And that the one thing that we all do agree on, for the most part, is using disability, that word itself, and trying to move away. And I'm seeing even increasing discussion around that in education, which is really exciting to see, because education has pretty firmly held on to special needs, special education. So we'll see what happens as language continues to evolve. So as I was looking through some literature for today, I found this pleasant quote, which I actually made a little briefer because the rest of it was even more harsh. But so this is from a Not Dead Yet advocate. That's an organization, Not Dead Yet. And this person said, if I were listing the most dangerous people in the US today, bioethicists, AKA medical ethicists, would top my list. And so I think I know there are reasons behind what Alice says, but I also think of just some incredible allies and advocates and friends that I have within the medical ethicist field, including right here at our hospital, Dr. Anta Maria, and I mentioned Dr. Lamphere, Joe Sturmondo out in California is a disabled ethicist. So I'm not ready to throw the whole field under the bus, but this guy is quite responsible for why the field is.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's some
of
the stuff with like Spectrum 10K and other ways of trying to eliminate disabilities, and not necessarily, you know, considering that it will always happen in some ways, or figuring out societal accommodation that the only solution is to eliminate disability.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're good. Peter Singer brings up like immediate reactions. Once you know him, you probably won't forget him. But yeah, he's at Princeton. I think I got that right. I usually throw the wrong Ivy League.
I know it's hard to remember. I think he flips around a little because he went to one and then teaches at another. So I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, I think he's there. And so, just for folks that are new to him, he is interesting conundrum of a guy because he's a very staunch animal activist. So he's very heavily in favor of not killing animals for food, and really is an animal rights
And uses
advocate. Yeah.
disability stuff to advocate for animal rights, that animals have higher value than people with disabilities, and
Yeah.
is one of those things which is common among groups to devalue one group to put up value to another group,
Yeah.
or
And when
even
he's
people within a group. Not saying
right.
it's right, but that happens. Sorry.
No, you're good. And when he's been asked to kind of keep it within the human field, how he explains some of his reasoning related to that. So this kind of lengthy quote is talking about how he believes that euthanasia of infants with disability is an important strategy that society should consider. And he bases a lot of this on the reasoning that the parents could go on to have a second, or a, whatever number that child is, and that future child would help them recover from the emotional loss of the life of the child that was euthanized. And so he's spoken at length on topics around infant euthanasia. Also, most recently, he made the news for a really, eugenics is an important word to connect with him that's brought up. He had some really controversial statements around that he doesn't believe that people with really significant disabilities are people per se. So he had made a statement that he didn't believe that rape of a person with a really significant disability should actually be considered rape. And so he really is a very controversial guy. I only just recently learned that his work is still included in city training, like his non-controversial work. So I found that kind of alarming, that I would hope that we could find somebody else for the city training. But yeah, I was just flagged of that the other day. So to kind of give you a little bit more of a positive spin on this, there's a good article by Kazuski called "It's an Agenda for Bioethics." And so it really lists through 5 agenda items that the field of bioethics could include that would recenter or better center disability and issues of disability. So, and really this looks at considering the full range of theoretical and practical issues of disability. So this article talks about how the field of bioethics gets a bit distracted by kind of the same topics. So assisted suicide is one that's discussed over and over and over again, whereas this author is bringing up the point that issues of, say, institutionalization of people with disability need the same kind of level of inclusion of discussion, rather than these hot topics that we just discuss over and over again only. So that brings up agenda item 2, is really urging bioethicists to embrace a right to community integration. Trying to have bioethicists assist in the public's understanding of disability in the life cycle. Understanding that, I think our public has a sometimes increased focus of disability in childhood, whereas we lose track a little bit about what it looks like into adulthood, and definitely what it looks like into individuals who are aging. So trying to expand society's view on that. Understanding and reforming research related to disability, also through the inclusion of those voices. And having bioethicists, their wording in this article was not be scared away from disability scholarship. So recognizing that there is quite a history of contention, but not having that result in a stoppage of dialogue, because it's so important for disability scholars and bioethicists to merge and have these discussions together. Right, so now we're
All right, so we're gonna get into the fun part, yeah. And I know I'm looking at the clock. All right, we're ready to go. So we're gonna do a couple of cases, and I guess we just want you to remember the kind of core principles, and then think about those core principles, but also what other narrative aspects you can go forward that we might need to help resolve. So we have a little guy with Down syndrome who's 3 years old, and he's been enrolled in OT and PT, but his insurance coverage has hit the limit, and his mom is calling you to help extend his services because she thinks the therapies have helped, and you also see that these have really helped him. She sent you the paperwork to complete and is now asking you to tell a little white lie to exaggerate his functional limitations to get additional services. So what what's your, you can go to the next one. What's your what are your thoughts on those? How might
I'm not
you
a
address
medical
that?
practitioner, but I have had to somewhat white lie about my own sort of things to try to qualify for when I had to live in New York State to show, because the only way you can get benefits is by showing that you're, I mean, I wouldn't like outright lie, but you sort of have to make it seem like you're gonna die if you're not, or you really can't function, or like you can't have like taking that, like I wouldn't have a good quality of life to being like, this is gonna be really hard or something.
Yeah.
To be any
Well,
to get in.
I think it
Sorry.
is good to know. I think you're right, because what you're speaking to is the parent voice that needs something that they see as beneficial. And we have this this connection then with the healthcare providers and what is their angst. So tell me, anybody who wants to pop in and talk about, I can only state the facts and truth. Anybody want to like get off like talk about it? Like, go ahead and speak up.
Yeah, I think in my career, there have been times when that was kind of before me, but I had to decide early on where my professional and personal integrity
Right.
were and stayed. And so in a non-threatening way, I just kind of mentioned to them that I am obligated to, identify the facts, say the truth, but I will also add some wording and some description that strongly suggests that it continue and ways that this could be supported.
Yeah. So you're really hitting veracity and fidelity with some additional information that might help get you to the same place.
Yeah.
The same desired outcome. That's great. Yeah.
Without compromise.
Right. And the risk of compromise is what, folks? I mean, you could be fraudulent. I mean, you could lose a lot. You could lose your license. You could, I mean, I'm just gonna, yes, loss of license. Thank you, Kara. Right. Other ways people have kind of, this does come up, right? I mean, there might be like little spin-offs from this, but other ways people have addressed that or walked through that conversation, words you've used.
I think I'm a social work trainee, and it's often hard because we have families that may have some type of health insurance policy, but like it would be better if they were just on Medicaid or Medicare. And like it's really hard because they're like, we can't even afford the care that our child needs. And like obviously social workers have license and we have a code of ethics that we're upheld to. So like kind of just affirming what the family's going through and recognizing that like, yeah, this is really difficult, but also recognizing there isn't much like that we can do except acknowledge that this is extremely frustrating.
Yeah. Well, and there are a lot of rules with insurance. So sometimes I also look at what have we coded. I don't code anything that's not accurate, but what are the options of coding that might help a pathway. Anybody else's thoughts on this one? Yeah, it's hard to get, someone who doesn't meet standards, it's hard to get long-term services. And this really does go back to, and other years, some of the OTPT folks have said, well, we really moved to a series of visits anyway. So our therapy isn't supposed to be, going on forever, but we need goals and a functional outcome to hit. And so I think even our system has shifted a little bit from you're in therapy for the next 5 years to what are we working on? Let's agree on an interval of service.
Which is better in some ways. I mean, I don't want to be in there like some of those things for long term without any goals or feeling like I'm getting strung along. It's just tough when you're sort of stuck in a system where you are basically only given support if you seem as like so bad that you are considered like that you are considered some way, or that there's sort of a very interesting way to where meaning disability advocates talk about this in other ways of how the Medicaid system and limits of an SSI and stuff are limiting what type of careers or jobs you can even get, or what type of employment or housing situations and other things, which is, sorry, outside the realm of what we're talking about, but not unconnected.
Yeah, well, I'm also curious if there's any parent voice here that wants to kind of talk about how they view therapy, because like I think what I also hear often when kids are doing better and feeling like people are peeling away the supports, that their network of support is going away. So I don't know if families have any, like the parents in Lend have anything they wanted to add to that kind of narrative.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, well, when we say that the therapy is in a number of sessions or sets, the difficulty that I'm finding is that because the type disabilities themselves are so varied,
Right.
that we're gauging what a set or how long someone should get the therapy based on either somebody who has a similar, or a child or an adult has similar disability, but not necessarily that disability, especially if those disabilities are rare. So whereas 5 years of therapy for one person could be the equivalent for somebody else is ongoing therapy. And so, and I know we have found that issue as well. And we're always having to set a new set of goals, and there's always the threat in front of us as to whether she's going to continue to have it. And so and that is the dilemma for us, because we're always worried that it's going to be discontinued at any time, but we don't necessarily know that she has reached her max,
right?
Because they don't know what her max is,
right? Yeah, and I see like there's a little bit of like a check-in. Sometimes I talk to about if you is less frequent visits with homework or community-based experiences, is that a replacement? Because what we also want to see is that community integration. And so if my PT turns into a gymnastics class, but I still get to see my PT every so often to make sure I'm on path, that is the direction we want to go. That's where we want kids to get. So any other thoughts on this one? I know we want to make sure we have a couple more, but also if you guys have cases, start thinking about things that you might want to talk about that you've had as dilemmas. So we can move to the next one, Kara.
Right. This one, and I was just typing in, but I didn't get it quite done because Dr. Wiley reminded me our own experience with my son. He did an intensive program over the summer in August, a little bit of September, that combined like reading and speech and audio processing. It was really cool. He did it 3 times a week and really made a lot of gains. And when we ended that, we had 3 afternoons after school. And so we worked, he found this on his own, but it was a perfect transfer. He had time then to do podcast club, which he's able to like think about the questions he's asking and try to speak clearly. Now, if I would have like suggested that for a 14-year-old, never in a million years would he have done that. But, it really worked out to be this awesome transfer of time from therapy to community pursuits that still get him to practice those skills. And just the other day, our SLP checked in on us. So I'm just super fortunate to be a mom of a patient of children's too. You guys are awesome. So those check-ins really, really do matter. This is an issue I kind of combined a couple of cases just to get us to think about the way we see these, what lenses we see these things through. So this is 2 school-age children with Down syndrome. Both have cancer, both are recommended for chemotherapy treatment that is estimated to be 70% effective. And so what that means is that if kind of all goes well, that there's a 70% likelihood that the cancer will be in remission after a set amount of time. So in this case, these are 2 cases. They don't know each other. I'm just presenting 2 different kind of reasonings that parents gave in this case to deny or to refuse treatment. So Mother A denied treatment, saying that she was concerned the child will not understand the negative side effects and would rather pursue holistic treatments. Mother B also denied treatment, but didn't describe her reasoning beyond an intuition and, quote, bad feeling about chemotherapy. So what are your thoughts on how you think that, medical teams responded or should respond to Mother A or Mother B? And do you see any differences in these reasons for denial, or what are your kind of reactions to these cases?
I think the medical team should make sure they give them all the information they can. And sometimes just because they denied it now, don't mean they won't come back and say, hey, let's try this. But I think they should just give them all the information they can and keep checking in with them and see how they're going,
Yeah, I definitely feel like we need more conversation and hearing more behind their worries. So I'd go back to that narrative, like what are the things we haven't yet heard? And I do think, so I like the idea of like we present information, but I think we need to listen to understand what those fear-based, because these also feel like a little fear-based.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would be scared too. So like,
Yeah.
and somebody said there's an assumption that their child won't understand, or maybe we don't have the resources, what are the resources to further educate parents and really also support the child. Yeah. Other thoughts people have?
I think for like OTPT, I don't know if the rest of the hospital does it, but we ask about a learning assessment, how they like to receive information and things like that. So maybe kind of stepping back and asking if they want to be more hands-on, videos, listening, reading, and meet them where they are.
And you mean for the parents or for the kids or both?
For both, typically depending on the age with the kid.
Yeah, totally. So I think there's a couple interesting things about these cases that are, actually do play out. One thing, the reason I included the 70% effective is I mentioned that, we do try to clarify gray areas where we can. And so that is kind of the threshold of where if parents refuse without kind of clear understanding, that we would at least have discussions around, well, is this considered medical neglect? If a parent refuses a treatment that all kind of healthcare providers decide is in the best interest, again, that best interest standard, that without this treatment, the child will die unnecessarily. These are all really hard questions that teams have to ask themselves. And so that 70% effectiveness is actually an important baseline. If the treatment success rate is estimated, because it is still an estimate, to be lower than that, and sometimes it is, then there's more leeway between or there's more kind of accepted flexibility and different parent decision. It's not to say that, either or both of these parents would be, it's a huge decision to pursue medical neglect. And so I'm not suggesting that would be necessarily the course of action, but I also wanted you to consider that you can think about all of the things that influence a person's ability to explain their reasoning. And when a parent rejects treatment that a treatment team recommends for whatever reason it may be, one of the things that concerns me is that a person's kind of successful ability to explain their reasoning in a way that fits with our medical system is often at play. So if a mom brings in a binder full of her holistic treatments that she's researched and she's going to go down this path, versus Mother B can't really explain herself well, has a bad feeling. And I also think about parental disability and how that plays out, and in trying to explain kind of yourself to a medical team and why you differ in what you want for your child based on what they recommend. So I think we also need to consider that when we ask, when we're having these conversations, we need to be careful about what how well someone communicates shouldn't necessarily be the only deciding factor on how we respond, because somebody might have just as good of reasons, but might need more time and might have a much more difficult time getting those reasons out.
Well, I think in A, I was confused about whether there were two components in there. One is about the child's understanding, which feels ableistic.
Mhm.
And then the other aspect is the pursuit of holistic care as a concept. So there were kind of two embedded, but Patricia also has her hand raised. So let's.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, this isn't, it's similar to these two cases. There was a situation probably at least 30 years ago where a child had been taken, she was an infant, had been taken to children's, and it looked like she may have had developed some kind of infection, like it had started in the foot, the toes, and they were going to amputate. I think it was either just the lower half of the toes or a few of the digits. But mom was very anchored in faith and prayer and said no. And the child was getting worse. And the mom continued to say she was anchoring in faith and prayer, and the infant died. Ended up dying from sepsis. And it was toward the end that she agreed to it, but by that time it had spread. I don't recall at all that there was ever a discussion with her about the option of her and her pastor coming to talk with the physician, or a discussion on utilizing both medicine and prayer.
Mhm.
But 30 years ago, they probably would not have. But today, I would think that would have been much more beneficial, and she may have been more amenable for that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that definitely is used today. Mhm.
Yeah, it's funny because when I was I was a medical student, so this was in the early 90s. We had a case of a family with Jehovah's Witness who the child needed a transfusion, and we had to take it all the way to a court order, and it turned out that the parents, and then we had I had, and some others in the team had moral angst about, will this child be denied from their community? It ended up as a good story because the family really felt like they had to do what their religious community told them to do, but they were kind of relieved that we saved their child. So, but there was a pastor of that community really pushing other treatment options that we did try, but they weren't effective. So it is, I think it really, again, it's not a one conversation and done. It's that understanding, it's that listening, it's who are the other voices that can help us get to an understanding. I like the idea of bringing, who do we need to bring to the table to help us get there together?
Mm-hmm. For sure. All right, we have one more that we'll share our slides after. I think, do we send those to Steph maybe?
Yeah, or Vicky or somebody, yeah.
You'll just need, this blue is actually a link that if you wanted to see kind of how, I wanted to share this case because it's one that's recent and also could give you an idea of how you would use your advocacy maybe to speak out about ethical issues, or speak not out necessarily, just involve yourself in the dialogue. So this case was covered, the original article that it was covered in was this, it was in Clinical Ethics in one of the last issues of 2021, titled Rethinking Individual Autonomy in Medical Decision-Making for Young Adults Reliant on Caregivers. So the article is pretty enraging, to me at least. The short of it is that there is a 26-year-old woman who has congenital neuropathy, which means that her vessel functioning has decreased throughout adolescence. So she relies on caregivers, which have been her parents, but her cognitive and intellectual functioning is intact. She became pregnant with a partner who she identifies as her boyfriend. And her parents gave her the ultimatum that she was to either terminate the pregnancy or move to a nursing home. So at that point, her parents involved her treatment team in her decision making. Like many young adults with complex medical conditions, she was still in a pediatric setting for her treatment team. And where it gets interesting is that the treatment team thought that they did such an incredible job at this that they published the full analysis in Clinical Ethics. So through their analysis, we're able to understand their or their reasoning upon this. So they decided that while she is a 26-year-old woman, that she didn't have many of the same social experiences. And one example they give is dating in high school. And so they felt like that she wasn't actually a 26-year-old woman socially. So despite not having an intellectual disability, they estimated that her social or emotional age was that of a 14-year-old. And so they determined that it was actually developmentally inappropriate for her to be excited about a pregnancy and think that a pregnancy was reasonable. And so kind of based on that mindset, they went through the whole process of questioning her about, how would she care for a baby, and they also assessed whether she was interested in adoption, which was very confusing to me because it didn't seem like the parents would be supportive of supporting her to carry a pregnancy. But anyways, the fact that she rejected the option of adoption was further evidence to them that she was not altruistic, was what they quoted. So what was also interesting was that they framed this whole case under a feminist approach, because they said that when we think of decision making about people reliant on caregivers, quote unquote, that we have to think of not just the individual, but the relationship, the family. So a feminist approach, which I found like really ironic, because in taking that approach, they basically shut the woman out of the picture, other than being this like vessel with her baby that they needed to deal with. So the end of this story is that the individual did decide to terminate. She moved home with her family, and the medical team kind of applauded themselves on this unique approach to this case. So what before I open it up for your thoughts, because I see a couple of hands, I wanted to let you know that this blue says response is a few of my colleagues and I wrote a response to clinical ethics. And so you can actually like see what that would look like, and maybe what you would take part in if you saw an article that either was something you wanted to positively reinforce or not. But you can kind of see like what that looks like and how we laid it out and how we provided like our supports and references, because it's not good enough to just say like, oh, this article makes me mad. Like, we really needed to point out that lots of reasons that it made us mad and what research supported our approach to this case. And so you can actually see that in a Google Doc form. I just made it view only. Please don't share it just because it's in pending for publication, but I thought it would be cool for you to look at. So, all right, I saw hands come up, but then I don't see them. So if you want to go off mute, go for it. Oh, Jason, and then Pat.
So you were saying a lot of that she doesn't have intellectual and developmental disabilities. So does that mean if she did, then this would be justifiable? Because I know people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who also get support, who also think that they,
Right.
Who understand consent, who have had sometimes relationships, who also want to have children, and generally.
Right. No. Hopefully you know me well enough that I'm not
I just wanted to
suggesting
make sure.
No, I'm trying to be
sure.
clear on the fact that she does have a significant physical disability, but I
Yeah.
think it's important to consider too that, I believe the age theory is not helpful for
I
us
think
in
it
any
is, too.
way. But
I think it is a lot of times, even with the way that we
Yeah.
do some of the age things for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I think that has a little bit of an interesting connotation to it, or even a IQ necessarily, because I mean, there's there's people who have really high IQs that are interesting, and people who have lower IQs that can do a lot of things. Just in my own, just from knowing me, some of it is about supports and systems being set up, but I don't think. I'm just curious curious because I think some people would argue just in general that like, oh, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities shouldn't at all. So I just wanted to make sure I understanding that makes sense to understand what the person's positionalities are, even within
No, but I think
disability.
there's an assumption often that a person with her level of disability would have.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
But we actually made the, actually, I don't think we ever consciously stated this intention, but I think it's just the approach that all three of us have, that we didn't center our argument on that, you know, because she had this superior intellect and because she didn't have a developmental disability, she should have been supported in her decision making. Instead, we centered our argument on the problematic nature of basically using the exclusion that she experienced because of her disability against her. So
yeah,
in our response, you'll be able to see, that it doesn't.
Yeah, because I just read books and stuff where people are like, well, this was bad because this person didn't have an intellectual disability, so they shouldn't have been in an institution overall, rather than like, sorry, I don't mean to be nitpicky. I just like to hopefully I don't seem too argumentative.
No, I think what you're hitting though, as this goes back to how we make our ethical decisions. If you go back to, you know, tenets of decision making, there are a number of factors that weigh in, but at the end of the day, is this whose best interest was this for, really? I mean, this best interest was for the parents, is the way I see it, and certainly no one else. So so I think if we bring it back also to those kind of ethical concepts, there may be arguments or discussion points in a variety of areas, and then counterpoints, and then what's the best interest. So,
and who wasn't at the table is another consideration. Right. There was nobody at the table related to like independent living or and when we say independent living, we don't mean like in an apartment by yourself necessarily. We mean, or a house, we mean there was no kind of future planning for her kind of outside of the pregnancy, whatever path that took. This case kind of ends as if, she is going to be forever captured as this, like what they estimate to be a 14-year-old individual with no real recognition that she's not. She's a 26-year-old. And so that was kind of another problem that we saw. So, Pat?
Yeah, I think it's so ironic as I was listening. I used to manage a teen moms program. And I think our youngest person who got enrolled in the program was either 12 or 14. Chronologically, I think she was 12. And she did go on to deliver the baby, and the baby came home with her. I don't know whether they offered the mom and her adoption or abortion. I don't know that. All I know is mom said no, she's going to have the baby. And I don't think there was ever a question about her competency. It was just, and she was 12. So it's just ironic as I was listening that competency never came up, even though they probably were thoughts about it. It never came up, but it did come up with this lady because of her disability.
Yeah, and that's exactly the double standard that we point out with a lot of the parenting work that I do, is that parents with disabilities are not, all of us are responsible for keeping, our kids safe and out of harm's way, but there's this double standard that's applied and competence is questioned in a different way. And I also find it interesting that there's this like generalization that it's like out of this world developmentally inappropriate for a 14-year-old to be excited about a pregnancy, because while that's, unusual, that's also changed in our landscape in the last several years. I mean, my great grandmother in Eastern Kentucky started, having children at 14 or 15. I mean, obviously we know that's not developmentally ideal, and there's lots of reasons, including gender equity, that I'm not suggesting that's the greatest path, but I'm just saying that we have shifted as a society in our values and our beliefs around that, whereas it's not like it's not always been out of this world for, in this case, she's not 14 though. So even I have to remind myself, because it was referenced so many times in this article as if she was. So, all right, well, we really want to hear from you on what topics you've thought of as you've heard us talk today? Does anything trigger about which situations have you experienced with ethical dilemmas? Great questions about telehealth too, if that's prompted anything more.
One ethical dilemma that I actually ran into, I was in clinic the other day, was working with a family that they're not from the United States and they aren't like legally in the United States. And the patient needed like Pediasure, but because the family is like low income and can't afford Pediasure, they don't have access to like Wicker Snap. And so I was extremely frustrated because it just seems like something that the hospital should be able to give. Like, I feel like we probably have Pediasure at the hospital. And like, even though they're not eligible to receive the same resources as families that have citizenship or are, you know, US citizens. I don't know, like I really struggled with like not being able to provide them with Pediasure, even though like we can refer them to a nutritionist or dietitian that can get them like the resources or tell them about like how to increase the child's like calorie intake. But I don't know, I just thought it was wrong and I struggled with it.
That's a hard one. I was curious if our social workers have any thoughts on resources because, you know, yeah, our systems are built up with to not cover everyone who's in the US. So anybody in social work know of resources? So that would be my one thought. And then my second thought would be based on experiences in Nicaragua that, you know, we thought about trying to bring down formula, but then that lasts as long as we're there and not really further. So what are the resources that are there that help with, you know, the calorie intake and safe feeding? So, you know, what are those high calorie foods that aren't too expensive? Yeah, and I see somebody put in the chat a resource link.
I'll also share too. Hi, I'm Maggie. I'm a social worker with the Perlman Center and CP Clinic, and I've worked with a lot of undocumented immigrants before. I had some success in working with our family financial advocates to get hospital cover, like hospital financial assistance to cover like diapers for one of our kiddos through the home care department. And then I also believe Pediasure, since it was medically necessary for his health. So that is an option that you could try to access and see if that could help.
Awesome. I see a question probably for Kara. What is the selection process for the ethics committee at Children's? Risha, do you want to, are you asking like who gets on it or what questions get pushed to ethics? What are you?
Who gets on it?
Who is on it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
How do you get selected to be on it?
I think they
Kara,
have,
yeah.
I know a little bit of this answer. They have different representatives or roles that they have to fill or have prioritized want to fill. There's a family representative on there, Hadia Khan, some of you might know her. There is a chaplain. There's somebody from that focuses on like child abuse, kind of that realm. So there's different kind of topic areas represented. But one of the interesting things that our Center for Dignity is exploring is most ethic committees don't have kind of a stated priority for a representative from the disability community. And so that may be one way to kind of have these issues remembered more often. But Dr. Wiley, do you know, is there other ways?
Yeah, no, I really don't. I mean, what I kind of know is Dr. Oppenheimer had been on it forever from our division, and then I got on it. And then when I couldn't really attend, I asked if Kara could get on it. So story, really, that's how I got Kara on. Well, I mean, like then she got like you got a whole interview, but yeah. So I'm not really sure either. And I think I agree with you. There's certain aspects that people are trying to make sure. Like I think there's folks who know a little more of the legal things as well. but I don't know like term limits and that sort of thing. I mean, I think it's a good question, especially around family voice and, you know, how much representation is enough. And, you know, if you have one family member, while I know, you know, Hadia is a great voice, she is representing many voices. And sometimes if you are the only voice at the table, you may not have the same space or confidence with only one person. You often need a little stronger grouping to have an effect. I mean, that's how I view voice anyway. I don't know if we can, like, is that a question that you could ask Armand that we could send back
I
to
know
Len?
the term limit question we have been talking about lately. So that's one that we don't know the answer of that in our committee ourselves. I mean, I think that, yeah, I think it's evolving. Everybody, I will say, I think it's a group that people enjoy and like being a part of, which is not always the case with all of our meetings that we do. But it's a place that is very, to me, feels safer than some places to bring up very different thoughts and perspectives and opinions, which is not something that's easy to create. You know, I do recognize, hopefully you've learned in Lynn that takes leadership to create that environment too. We have some great, Dr. Wise added some kind of hot topics here too that are other disability specific ethical dilemmas. Jason brought up the Ashley X case in the chat box. So that's known as growth attenuation. There was a very highly covered case called the Ashley X case where these procedures remove breast buds and also do like a complete hysterectomy of women with very significant disabilities at their parents' request, with the idea that it will stop their growth. So the argument made for these procedures is so that the parents could still more easily transfer, pick up, move the child, and that the child nor the parents or caregivers would have menstruation to deal with. But as you can imagine, the controversy against that is they're very invasive procedures that have lots of consequences in and of themselves. And yeah, so there's a lot of controversy around that in terms of it's a little bit secretive where these procedures still happen in the US. They still do happen. There's kind of underground websites. Some of them are termed pillow angels because of the idea of, you know, stopping people's growth and kind of this perpetuity of childhood where parents kind of network to find where these procedures take place. And then menstrual suppression, the idea of, so that can be offered for very valid medical reasons, but sometimes people seek that out for a roundabout way to you know, prohibit or stop a person's ability to get pregnant, and they're not being, again, that veracity, they're not being totally truthful with the purpose of seeking that treatment. They have another reason in mind, and so that sparks ethical discussion as well. And then allocation of services has been a huge topic related to COVID. There's, you know, concerns about crisis care standards in terms of where does people with disabilities fare in standards like who has the greatest likelihood to survive, or who will be able to recover but will require less attention from our staff.
Wasn't at the beginning of COVID, there was even concern from some people with disabilities that some of their stuff was actually being taken away, like medical, like if somebody was using like had some ventilators or something for themselves and they went to the hospital, that there was concerns that they would have those taken away from them and given to somebody else.
Yeah. To our knowledge, that didn't happen, but there was concerns the way that some of the crisis care standards were written that it could happen, because a lot of times like ventilation devices are actually the technical property of like a medical supply company. And so there, in some of those early crisis care standards, there was some really concerning language around that those medical supply companies would kind of gather up all their supplies and then send them to hospitals instead of people's homes. And so lots of concerns with that. And then guardianship, I know you guys have talked a bit about that. That's always a
Yeah.
hot topic as well. And there are, here's a couple of screenshots from the AAP, as well as AAIDD, American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, that have both put out position statements that have deemed growth attenuation to be unjustifiable. So sometimes in these cases, you do have these professional entities kind of take a more clear stance, in this case, against growth attenuation.
Wasn't
Other times,
this case like the one that you just referenced, where they published their materials in some way, saying that it was
Yeah.
sort of a revolutionary type thing? When
Yeah, I think it was a case in New England Journal of Medicine, and that is a high premier journal, which is also why it got so much traction and attention, which maybe is a good thing, because it also brings out the voices of that needed to be at the table about this. And I really, sadly, what I see that case is a lack of sufficient resources. I feel like these cases are coming out of fear and lack of support in families take. So there's not enough support. They're worried that their child might be raped. They're worried, which, because it happens. And so the fear-based piece, is clearly some of the reasons behind the family asking for these. And so again, I'm trying, I know I am not in support, but I think it's important for us to understand why these things come about, and we can continue to advocate, but also respect and understand where those core challenges are, which gets people to this degree of an intervention.
Yeah, I totally agree. I admire organizations that do the hard work of kind of hosting these dialogues too. It's really tough. Where I take part in some activities with the Little People of America organization, which has a lot of collaborations with medical partners, but is very community driven by people with dwarfism themselves. And so LPA has made similar statements to this against limb lengthening, but more recently we've had conversations about there's new drug treatment by the drug company BioMarin that could be given to infants with achondroplasia that would in many ways kind of erase facial features or stop facial features dysmorphia that's related to achondroplasia from developing, and would with daily injections would provide some additional growth. So LPA has been kind of caught in the middle of the crossfire of lots of different really divisive thoughts and opinions, and these conversations can get heated. And so there is a question of like, would we rather just let this happen online and without us, or as an organization, do we want to kind of bring people to the table and figure out how can we all still have a community of support while respecting that we may have different opinions about what treatments are best for our kids and for us.
That's an interesting statement too, because I sat on the Council on Children with Disabilities for quite a while through the AAP, and they wanted to write a policy against this, but yet they were afraid that if it had died down, they didn't want to refuel the fire.
Yeah.
So am I doing more harm by bringing it back into the public eye?
Right. Those are all things to think about.
So as you see, at the end of our hour, we have not answered much of anything, right? Because
we do best.
These are just not always easy. And I think this was something Ann Lovell had put that I think is a nice kind of ending point, because we are all pilgrims on a journey, travelers on the road. We're here to help each other walk the mile and bear the load. I will weep when you are weeping. When you laugh, I'll laugh with you. I'll share your joy and sorrow till we've seen this journey through. And I think, we have entered a field where we really are journeying with many families, many different families, many who are different from us, and many that are similar to us. And, I guess that's where I love what I do, because every day I learn something new. Every day I might have some question or concept posed to me to make me rethink. And hopefully it's made me a better person over time. So good luck on your journey.
Yeah, same. And I know we're both happy to answer questions after this. I know it's almost SCBM time, but thank you for your all's
Give you a-
thoughtful questions and responses.
Give you a bathroom break. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. All right.
All right. Thanks all.
Thanks you.